Hi, everyone. The individuals in this photograph demonstrate the palpation of the carotid artery. This particular photograph was produced in 1897 and was used for decades later as the basis for some of the earliest first aid illustrations in the US, some of which were included in this 1904 handbook, a 1908 handbook, and a 1912 version as well. In all of these first aid handbooks, the explanation for this move is the same. It reads, "Remember, all wounds bleed a little, but as a rule, this bleeding will stop in a few minutes if the patient is quiet. Occasionally, but not often, something else must be done." There is no more description. There is no explanation of the wounds this move is supposed to treat or the scenarios in which one would use this first aid move. Indeed, there is no explanation of the move itself. This image is all you get. We can ask any number of questions regarding the implicit assumptions within first aid demonstrations. Why is the figure almost always a man and white? Or if this is a demonstration of how to care for an injured person, why is the focus of this image on the injured and not the person performing first aid? Or why does it seem like common sense for first aid demonstrations as a whole to not depict pain? There's something strange happening in this photograph that is outside of the conventions typically associated with how individuals are depicted for the public. A new convention of depicting and viewing bodies was developing at this time, one in which bodies were viewed as psychologically vacant and absent of feeling. And this convention was fundamentally intertwined with the advancing industrialization taking place at the turn of the century. At this time, technological euphoria had generated an industrial worldview. This worldview reformulated all of society's actions and the individual's actions in relation to the central cultural symbols of making, producing, and consuming. These photographs that served as the basis for many subsequent first aid illustrations are currently housed within the National Museum of Health and Medicine. These are some of the earliest first aid demonstrations ever. In the context of late 19th, early 20th century portraiture, an artist by the likes of John Singer Sargent or John Singleton Copley would have depicted the sitter in a state of postured, self-confident presentation. The presentation of a confident psychological interiority was present for the upper classes as well as the working classes. For example, in George Bella's Paddy Flanagan, Flanagan here turns his chin cockily towards his left shoulder. Bellow's composition then draws the viewer's eye down from the left shoulder to Flanagan's left thumb, which nonchalantly hangs through the belt loop of his pants. He exudes self-confidence, even belligerence, despite his chest being exposed for the painting. The sitter in the first aid demonstration also has his chest exposed, yet Flanagan's arms are open and self-assuredly relaxed, whereas the sitter in the demonstration withdraws his arms close to his torso, as if protecting his exposed self. Even when Bellows and other portraitists depicted the lower classes, the conventions demanded that the sitter emote at least an intellectual state, if not a certain amount of self-confidence, rather than psychological emptiness of the kind within the first aid demonstration. A more appropriate comparison might be made using Thomas Aiken's late portraits. Aikens was notorious for avoiding the depiction of a self-confident presentation. Instead, he drew upon the visual rhetorics traditionally employed for the depiction of defeated others, such as social outcasts, subalterns, or conquered enemies. In Aiken's Edith Mahan here, Mahan's gaze contains a similar variety of defeat as the figure in the first aid demonstrations. Both sitters stare laconically just past the portraitist. Both compositions veer towards asceticism. There is no attempt at grandiosity or heroism, typical of other portraits at the time. But the edges of Mahan's mouth turn upward. She seems to ruminate rather than withdraw psychologically. Oops. The first aid demonstration contains an emotional unavailability, whereas Aiken's portraits are unique in their investigation of sensitive suffering. Clearly, this is an image of a person, yet it is not a portrait of them. How is that even possible? Under what conditions is an image of a person not a portrait of them? These images were continually reproduced and learned by many, and perhaps there was the assumption that anyone could have been the injured or the caregiver. These individuals came to be seen as anyone. Illustrators converted these photographs' depictions into etchings, which were then duplicated for handbooks and reproduced yet again years later by the American Red Cross, here seen on the right. In the process, these photographs constructed an understanding of whiteness as normalized, as anyone, as everyone. Automaticity and reproducibility were paramount in the production of these images. These first aid demonstrations represent an industrialized form of care. The injuries they intend to treat are those typically seen on the battlefield, and yet industry at the turn of the century had enough warlike injuries to adopt this battlefield care for the civilian workplace during peacetime. Take, for instance, this excerpt from a story about first aid from a 1927 YMCA handbook. The story revolves around a figure named Nick. While at work one day, the usual warning of an acid fire was heard. Men rushed from every direction into the fresh air to escape the deadly fumes. Nick was out only a few minutes when he missed BN 894, the man at the next machine where the fire had occurred. He looked around as the air was fast being cleared and, failing to see his fellow worker, pulled his cloth over his mouth and started up the stairs. There lay his prostrate friend. Quickly he brought him to the fresh air and assisted the foreman in administering first aid. It took but a few moments to clear the air and to have the work running on as usual. BN 894 awoke from his stupor, got up, and started back to work. Notice they referred to him as a barcode not once, but twice in the same paragraph. I mean, they couldn't have just invented a name like John or something. Another excerpt from a 1915 edition of Coal Age, a magazine dedicated to the coal mining industry, described how one should encounter the scene before administering first aid. It says, "Look the injured person over carefully, find out how badly he is injured, and then proceed with the work. Don't attempt unnecessary movements. See that the injured part is in position as nearly normal as possible, except in a compound fracture and dislocation of the hips and shoulders." What kinds of injuries necessitates the instructions, see that the injured part is in position as nearly normal as possible? Obviously, grisly injuries. The nature of the injuries themselves is also evident in the first aid moves. They focus on stemming massive blood loss with palpation of the subclavian and brachial arteries, as seen here. They involve splints that extend from the hip to the ankle, and explanations of tourniquets. The figure of macabre but invisible injuries casts a shadow over these first aid demonstrations, and these injuries occurred often enough to warrant standardized care for them, care that lasts just long enough to get the injured to professionals. It's at this time that efficiency expert F.W. Taylor reconceptualized the individual worker as a piece of machinery, whose every motion could be precisely timed, standardized, and controlled. This eventually became known as Taylorism. I cued the table saw upstairs just in time for this presentation. The human at this time began to resemble an artifact of industrial creation. The worker, just as they are alienated from their labor, becomes alienated from the other in need of medical aid, and a specific visual rhetoric was employed in facilitating this mechanistic worldview. And what a strange, farcical rhetoric it was and is. A rhetoric in which the sitter exudes no psychological interiority, shows no pain, no sense of struggle. There are important political consequences that arise from not showing pain. given any two phenomenon, the one that is most visible will receive the most attention. The depiction of pain in this way is a method for heightening visibility. Pain functions as a ground from which potential protest can arise. The deletion of pain within these first aid demonstrations preempts any possibility of hope for better working conditions, an extended temporality, or a human body with a future beyond its expenditure as a cog within a machine within a factory. The provision of aid and assistance to factory workers through visuals such as these that ignore the presence of pain, though laudable in humanitarian terms, normalized the political content of these accidents. This occurred by shifting the focus to acute short-term suffering while neglecting the long-term view of the working conditions that caused the suffering in the first place. There was a deliberate decision not to perform pain in these first aid demonstrations in order to preserve objective distance from the subject in need of help. The desire to help or aid more effectively, efficiently, and with greater economies of effort through the elimination of any depiction of pain eclipsed the important and unrealized political necessity for pain to be visible. If there is no evidence of injury, then there is no path to grievance. This is the problem with not showing pain. The absenting of pain within these first aid demonstrations, under the pretext it would be a more rational form of medical aid, actually eliminates those bodies' ability to be seen. These demonstrations normalize the ever-present danger inherent in factories, rail yards, and mines. They do this by signifying care. Rather than eliminate the dangers in the workplace, these demonstrations manage the human cost required in that workplace. Thus, workers are produced along with their products and repaired similarly. All wounds bleed a little, but as a rule, this bleeding will stop in a few minutes if the patient is quiet. Indeed, if the patient is quiet, the bleeding will stop and work will go on as usual. I am wary of situations in which an image of a person is not a portrait of them. It signals a moment when the possibility of a human being capable of deep feeling, of torment or struggle grows dim. There's a fine line between helping and hurting. Even the visual language of bandaging up and tying down bear eerie similarities. It's important for pain to be visible. Suffering is part of a fully feeling subject. It's crucial. Subjectivity requires it. Erasing suffering equates the human with nothing more than a machine. Because if there is no suffering, in a sense, there is no human. Thank you.